Okay. Right? So, the amount of blood that flows in and the amount of blood that flows out. Let's talk about that. In a normal 24-hour day, about 20 liters of fluid gets pushed out of those capillaries, about 20 liters, okay? And what happens is that on a normal day, on the arterial side, blood gets pushed out, fluid gets pushed out, and on the venous side, it gets sucked back in. And we're going to talk about why in just a moment. But anyway, it gets sucked back in, okay? So normally, about 20 liters gets pushed out, and about 17 liters gets sucked back into that capillary, okay? Fluid out of those capillary beds, right? So, those of you that are math genius, 20 minus 17 is
3.
3. There you go. About 3 liters a day doesn't get sucked back into the bloodstream, right? Well, what would happen if that situation went on all day long, day after day, day after day? 20 gets pushed out and only 17 gets sucked back in. What would happen? We get a buildup of fluid, right? We get a buildup of interstitial fluid, yes? Right? Remember, interstitial fluid, the fluid around those cells are always bathed in interstitial fluid, right? Interstitial fluid is the bulk of extracellular, outside the cell, extracellular, right? Remember? Interstitial fluid, right? You got fluid around them all the time, yes? More sodium on the outside, more potassium on the inside, yada, 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 okay? But if this situation, if every day we're pushing out 20 and only sucking 17 back in, then what would happen is, boom, 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 we'd get abdomen full of fluid, we'd swell up, our face would get fatter, 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 our ankles and our feet and such, right? So, the one thing I didn't draw in the picture is lymphatics. Lymphatics, right? The lymphatic system, yes? Lymphatic system picks up, guess how much? How many liters? Any guesses? Bingo! 3 liters, right? So, 20 gets pushed out, 17 gets sucked back in, but that extra 3 liters, it gets picked up by the lymphatic system. And that's the next chapter, but anyway, that's for Monday. And the lymphatic system, it's only one way. It goes back towards the heart, right? And the lymphatic capillaries are called lacteals, and they are blind-ended, which means they're round on the ends. They stop, and we'll learn too on Monday that they have flaps. And what happens is the flap closes and opens to drain off that extra lymphatic fluid, to drain off that extra 3 liters, okay? Right? Otherwise, we'd swell up gradually, swell, and get worse and worse and worse, okay? Now, we need to talk about, remember, if we had our tube, we had this much water and this much water, right, in a semi-permeable membrane right there. If we took a piston right here and we pushed down with the piston, then this would go up, right? And that's an example of hydrostatic pressure. The water is pushing against the sides of the container, and because we're pushing down here, the water's going to go, and this side is going to go up, right? And the level's going to go up. Yes? hydrostatic pressure, okay? Now, hydrostatic pressure is another fancy way of saying blood pressure, right? Because when the heart squeezes, it puts pressure, right? Remember we talked about those elastic arteries last night? Yes? And so when that happens, that puts pressure. In the same way, whenever this blood from the arterial side is coming through here, it has hydrostatic pressure. It has blood pressure. And that blood pressure pushes fluid out into the capillary bed. Okay? Now, there's another force also. Remember when we did this? And if we started out and it was level and there was just a tiny bit of salt here and a whole bunch of salt there, right? Remember, tiny little bit of salt, whole bunch of salt here, right? Then what's going to happen in time, an hour later, is that water is going to move this way, right? Osmotic pressure. Yes? Because the semi-permeable membrane, the solute can't go through, but the water can, and the water is moving to try and equalize one side or the other. Body likes balance, equilibrium, okay? Right? And so because of that, if you come back an hour later, this is going to go down and this is going to go up, right? Yes, that goes down, this goes up, right? And that's because osmosis, the movement of water, okay? So, you have to understand this concept and this concept, right? Yes? Okay. Okay. You ever done that, Joseph? Yes? So whether the fluid goes out or whether the fluid goes in, it's a tug of war. It's a tug of war between team hydrostatic pressure, the heart squeezing, making blood pressure, and that's going to make some water get pushed out. On the other side of that, as blood flows through our vessels, guess what? There's protein in the blood. There are other solutes, and that protein in that solutes makes the water from outside the blood want to come into the blood to try and equalize the balance. So it's a fight between team hydrostatic pressure and team osmotic pressure as to whether the fluid's going out or in. Okay? Now, when we get down to the capillary blood bed, okay, the hydrostatic pressure is about 34 millimeters, okay, about 34. When it comes out over here on the venous end, guess what it is? About half that, 17. Let me make sure I got my numbers right. Oh, 35 and 17. I'm sorry, I'm wrong. 35 and 17. About half. Okay? It's about half. Right? Well, why does that matter? Okay, this is a really tough one, but I'm going to ask Madison. I think she's going to get it right. Which is larger, 35 or 17?
35.
Bingo! Right? So on this end, the hydrostatic pressure is pushing water out. But guess what? As that fluid goes through all these little bitty channels and all that pressure gets split up, by the time it gets over here, it's only 17 millimeters, okay? About half as much, right? And that's why 20 liters get pushed out and about 17 get sucked back in, okay? And we're going to figure out exactly why that is here in just a second, right? But there's a force that wants to push water out of the blood vessel, and that's hydrostatic pressure. And there's a force that wants to suck the water back into the blood vessel, and that is osmotic pressure. So it's a tug of war between the two, okay? Now, if I have a little diagram right here, it's on the next page. It's figure 1817, the second part of it, right? If this is a blood pressure, if this is the arterial side, right here, as we go into these, right? The hydrostatic pressure, the pressure pushing out, is 35. 35, okay? Now, the osmotic pressure, remember there's protein, albumin, and solutes in our blood, and because of that, that's going to make water suck back in. So the osmotic pressure is 26, okay? Now, hydrostatic pressure, interstitial fluid, right? The interstitial fluid, does it have any pressure? Osmotic pressure? No, it doesn't have a heart pumping, shoving against the walls of the blood vessel. No, so that is 0. 35 plus 0. However, hydrostatic, osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid, 1. So all these out here, there are some solutes out here. There's some salt, there's some sodium, there's some potassium, there's probably some sugar, right? So it exerts a little bit of osmotic pressure to pull a little bit out, okay? Let me make sure I got the numbers right here. Okay. Got it wrong. 35 plus 1, 26 plus 0. Okay? Minus equals 10 NFP. Okay? Now, if I add up all the pressure that's pushing fluid out, I get 35 plus 1. Now, if I subtract the osmotic pressure, 26 plus 0, 35 plus 1 is 36, minus 26 equals 10 net filtration pressure. Okay? That means there's an extra 10 millimeters on this end we're talking, pushing. So the net filtration pressure is 10. And what that means is, on this side of it, right? Team hydrostatic pressure wins, and it pushes fluid out. However, when we go to the other end over here, and we run the numbers, the hydrostatic pressure has dropped to 17, okay? Okay? Down here at the venous end, the osmotic pressure is still the same, 26. The osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid is still the same, 1. And the hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid is 0, right? So when we run the numbers now, instead of 35, we have 17. 17 plus 1 minus 0 plus 26. Up here I wrote 26 plus 0 anyway. And what I get is minus 8. Okay? Minus 8. So, it's not the exact same amount of net filtration pressure, right? The plus 10 tells me This is more powerful. This is going to push so much out because it's a higher number. It's the pushing force, right? That's where we get the, oh, by the way, 20 liters. But over here on this end, because the hydrostatic pressure is lower, the numbers come out. Here it's in 10 plus 10 millimeters net filtration pressure, but over here it's -8 net filtration pressure. And because it's a negative number, it's not pushing. It's sucking fluid back in. And that is why 20 liters gets pushed out, but only 17 liters gets sucked back in. Okay? If it was plus 10, minus 10, it'd be a wash. It'd be equal, but it's not. It's plus 10 minus 8. Okay? The plus tells us hydrostatic pressure, the pressure pushing out is more. The -8 tells us the pressure sucking in is -8. Right? The difference between 10 and -8, right? If it was 10 and 10, it'd be equal, but it's not. And what that tells us is, oh, by the way, I have more pushing out than I have sucking in. And what did we say a bit ago? About 3 liters has to get picked up by the lymphatics, right? Because it's not plus 10 minus 10. It's plus 10 minus 8. So the amount pushing out, the amount sucking back in is not as much. And that's why there's a difference there. So basically, you add up all the pushers and you subtract all the ones that are causing suction, and you get the difference, and that tells you the net filtration pressure. Okay? And the main thing I need you to get from this is, think about this. The arterial side, we take our blood pressure. What's normal blood pressure? 120/80. Do we take blood pressure in veins? No. Because that blood has come from the heart all the way through the arterial system, and then in through the capillary beds, and then into the venous system. If you cut an artery, especially a big one, it goes spurt, spurt, spurt. And if you cut a vein, what does it do? Dribble, dribble, dribble. Right? Oh, by the way, 35/17. Right? So on the venous end, do the veins go boom, 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 boom? Are you going to take a pulse in a vein? No. You're going to take a pulse in an artery, right? Okay? So that explains that. The arteries have higher pressure, and the media layer, tunica media, right? And an artery is much thicker and much more muscular. And if you cut an artery and you look at it under the microscope, it looks like that. And you can see, what's the hole in the middle called? Anybody remember? That's the lumen, right? The lumen. Conversely, if you cut a vein, you slice it and you put it under a microscope, what does it look like? This. It collapses. Why does it collapse? It doesn't have very many muscles in its wall. It's much thinner. Why is it much thinner? There's not near so much pressure. Right? Right? And so that's the difference in the arteries and the veins. Yes? Okay? But the whole concept is, here's a capillary bed. Blood is going to get shunted where it needs to go. And when blood flows through it, as the blood flows in, it's higher pressure. As it comes out, it's lower pressure. And that is going to be responsible for the fluid coming out. And the interstitial fluid around here is constantly being changed. It's not the same fluid all the time. It's constantly being changed, right? And the difference in how much is pushed out and how much is sucked in, our body, if it's working properly, if the lymphatics are working properly, then we're not going to swell up. Okay? Now, I've had a lot of patients over the years that had the breast cancer and maybe had a mastectomy, a radical mastectomy. And what do they get? Swelling in the arm. How come? Their lymphatics were cut out or destroyed, right? And when that happens, it doesn't drain properly and they swell up. So they have to wear the little garment, the little stocking. Lymphedema, right? Yes, lymphedema, right? See? Because 20 is getting pushed out, 17 is getting sucked back in, but their lymphatics are gone. And because their lymphatics are gone, they don't drain that extra fluid off, and they swell up, and get very tight. So the physical therapists do many different things, but one of the things they do is they fit them for a garment, and it slides up, and it fits around here usually, and it squeezes, and that squeezing pushes that lymphatic fluid back where it should go, right? Okay? Lymphedema. That's in the next chapter too, but I like you, so I gave you a freebie. So, okay? Anyway, that's the main thing. If we add up the pushing forces, we subtract the sucking forces, and that's where that comes from. Okay? And in a perfect world, right, we don't swell up. In a perfect world, the same amount of fluid that goes out comes back in. And we're healthy, and we don't swell up. You know, these older people, their lymphatics don't work so well, this and that. I've been on trips with them many times, and by the end of the day, you know, their ankles are getting fat and all, and right from, oh, I did all this walking and stuff. Yeah, right? Yes. So anyway, but in order to get this, you have to understand this, right? And again, when I'm taking a test, if it says hydrostatic pressure, I just think blood pressure. This is what I think, right? But anyway, that's not exactly correct, but that's what I think. Okay? Alrighty, here we go. Now, last time we talked about the elastic, the muscular arteries, and the arterioles. And we talked about the continuous capillaries, the fenestrated ones, the ones with all the holes in them, and the sinusoids, right? Now, just a little bit about the veins, right? It's easier for fluid to go through the veins because they're not so thick, right? It's easier for white blood cells to go through the veins, right? Think about if I have an infection somewhere and those neutrophils have to go to the site of infection, right? Yes? And so they've got to, it's called diapedesis, right? They got to get there, they got to go through that capillary into the tissue to get to the bad germs or whatever it is they got to get rid of, right? Okay? Do you remember this diagram? Here's our skin. Here's a nail sticking in the skin, right? Here's a blood vessel right next to it. Yes? Then you have CAM, cellular adhesion molecules, these white blood cells sticking right here, right? Lining the blood vessel. And then, oh, by the way, they go through the fenestrations, through the holes, into the tissue, right? And that's called diapedesis, P-E-D-E-S-I-S, diapedesis, right? They're walking through. Dia means through, diathermy. It puts heat through the tissue at a deep level, diapedesis, right? Oh, by the way, these white blood cells lining up are called margination. Margination, right? Here's a piece of paper, right? What are the edges of the piece of paper called? The what? Margins. The margins, right? So when the white blood cells line up, that's called margination, the edges of the blood vessel, right? Make sense? Okay? And here's the bad stuff. Yes? And when we have an injury, our body will give off certain, sometimes they call them wound hormones, inflammatory chemicals, right? And what happens is you get positive chemotaxis. Positive chemotaxis. And what in the heck does that mean? Right? That means this tissue that's been injured is giving off signals, and the signals, right? Let me explain. When I was a kid, my grandmother made 3 loaves of bread, and she opened that window and set it on the windowsill. If I'm outside playing, man, I'm getting in the house quick, right? Because my older brother could eat like a pig. But anyway, yeah, because I can smell it, right? Positive chemotaxis, right? Chemo for chemicals, for wound hormones or inflammatory chemicals, whatever you want to say, right? But that positive chemotaxis is the movement of the white blood cells to the site of injury, right? Think about a homing device, right? You watch Batman, yeah? But anyway, okay? So, got to get these words. They'll come up again. Margination. Those white blood cells line up along the margins of the blood vessel. Diapedesis. The white blood cells go through the holes, right? And remember, the capillaries, the endothelium, one cell, and there are holes there where fenestration, maybe we would say, so that they can go through. And when that white blood cell goes into the tissue, we call that diapedesis, right? And the white blood cell, the neutrophils, they know where to go because of positive chemotaxis, because they can smell it. They know where the problem is, and they're going there, right? Yes? It's like in a war, and they're shooting and this and that. Most guys, what do? Duck down and move away. And what do the Marines do? They hear shooting, they grab their gun and go running towards it, right? They're the only force that does that, by the way. That's what happens. Yes? You know, in the Gulf War, anytime they were attacked by the terrorists, they called the Marines, right? And the terrorists knew they had a short amount of time, and then the Marines were showing up to kill them. That's what would happen, right? But anyway, yes. So, the neutrophils, boom, right? Okay, the lumen. Make sure you get that. The inside, this hollow part, is the lumen of the blood vessel. Okay? Now, let's talk just a little bit about the difference between arteries and veins. Okay? Arteries are pressure reservoirs, right? Right? Remember we talked about those elastic artery? Remember I drew the picture of the little car with a balloon, and you hold your finger on it and you set it down. That balloon holds the pressure until you let it go and the car goes rolling, right? In the same way the arteries do that. The arteries, especially that aorta, stretches and then gradually relieves that pressure and it goes back down. And it stretches at the next heartbeat and then it goes back down, right? So the arteries are pressure reservoirs. Arteries have blood pressure to them. There will be a systolic and a diastolic. But by the time you get way over here to the venous end, there's a constant pressure. There's no systolic or diastolic. Okay? Now, but veins have a different job. Veins bring blood back to the heart. Okay? Veins are called capacitance vessels. Okay? Pardon me. Reservoirs. Same word. reservoirs. Okay? Right? Now, you go to Amarillo, you go in most restaurants, right at the front, you look in the door, and what is there a sign that says? What does the sign say? It says how many people can be in that restaurant, right? So what does the sign say? Say that again?
Is it max capacity?
Capacity, right? Yes, maximum capacity. Yes, you're correct. Yes. But the word I'm looking for is capacity, and the veins are capacitance vessels. Okay? And what that means is this. Only so much blood is in the heart, only so much blood is in the arteries. And the veins have the ability to stretch and get bigger. Okay? And they serve as reservoirs for the blood. Okay? So, if I'm laying on the couch, do I need tons of blood coming back to my heart? And my heart boom, 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 boom beating? No, I don't. Right? So at that point, the veins are going to get bigger. They're going to hold extra blood. They're going to be a reservoir. Right? Now, in San Antonio, right, they have big reservoirs. Right? And when it rains, guess what it does? The water runs into the reservoir. Right? And the reservoir fills up. And then little by little, they got pipes coming out of the reservoir, and the pipes go to the water system, and they clean the water, and look, you're drinking groundwater. Pardon me, surface water, not groundwater. They didn't drill it out of the ground. Here in Dalhart, Texas, we drill a well down, we drink groundwater, right? But there, and what happens is they get in big trouble, because there's so many people in San Antonio, if it don't rain, and the reservoirs go way down, and then they say, oh, you can't water your grass, blah, 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 right? It's a reservoir. In the same way, the veins are reservoirs for blood until it's needed. And when it's needed, the veins will constrict and squeeze, and that blood will come back to the heart, okay? Now, there's actually a chart in the book that tells you exactly what the percentages are. So if you want to, you can look at that. But the main thing I need you to get is the arteries, thicker wall, because they're pressure reservoirs, and the veins are capacitance reservoir, right? They'll hold a lot, they have a higher capacity, and the pressure is much lower, okay? Okay, now, let's talk about okay. I'm sure you can tell by looking. That's a vein. That's a vein in your calf. And these are your gastroc muscles, right? Gastrocnemius. You should know those. Yes? Right? And so what happens is this. Those veins have valves that do this, right? Okay? From my big toe, that blood's got to go back to my heart. Well, gravity makes it want to sink, right? And as this blood is flowing back, it goes through these valves. Yes? And the trouble is, some people genetically have bad veins. Some people have to stand up all day long. Nurses, pharmacists, me, right? And so what happens is, the trouble is, these get stretched out, and the veins become incompetent, and they don't close well, right? And what is that called? Bingo. Varicose veins, right? Yes. Some people genetically have that. Some people because of their job, right? Some people you have an accident and such. But anyway, varicose veins, yes. And when they're on the surface and they're very superficial, what do we call those? What kind of veins? Arachnid veins, right? What's an arachnid?
Spider.
Thank you. Spider veins, right? When they're on the surface, we get the little spider veins, right? And when they're the deeper ones, we get the big tortuous where they're stretched out, right? You seen a 90-year-old lady that's overweight and the big legs and the big blue veins, right? Right? Okay? So, that's what happens. It's very common. Now, where do we have those? We have those, I'm embarrassed, above the joints and below the joints. Above the ankle and below the ankle. Yes, when we get old, we'll have them all the way up, right? But when we're younger, we have them above and below the joint. Now, why would that be? Because my joint's doing this all day long, right? When I squeeze it, I may squeeze off some blood vessels, right? And the blood backs up in the veins, and the veins get stretched out in time. Yes? And so, or, like I said, too, standing up all day long. Who else? Who else? Give that girl a gold star. Pregnant ladies, right? They get the varicose veins in their legs. Oh, by the way, you don't eat enough fiber, right? And your stools are really hard, right? And guess what you get? You get varicose veins. Guess what those are called? I was not going to make you say it. Yes, that's what it's the same deal. It's the same deal as what's in your legs, only it's down there, right? A lot of pressure down there, right? Eat more fiber. But anyway, varicose veins. And again, around the anus, they're called hemorrhoids. Yes? Now, let me explain too. I'm just going to skip ahead for a minute. Yes? When we do this, when we breathe, we pump blood back to the heart. Right? When we walk, when we move, guess what we do? The muscles contract and squeeze the blood out of them. Okay? The one is called the respiratory pump, and the muscles are called the muscular pump. Right? That's why when you sit on the airplane and don't move for 15 hours, your muscular pump is not working. Right? In fact, some A&P teachers call the calf the peripheral heart. Because as you walk, as you move, as you jump up and down, it squeezes blood back to the heart. So some A&P teachers call it the peripheral heart, right? Your gastrocs and the soleus, the triceps surae. But anyway, okay? So, to get that blood back, and again, the veins with the valves are mainly in the extremities, right? Because they're long and they're hanging down, and we got to get the blood back to the heart, and we don't want the blood to backflow, right? Bad in the heart, bad in the extremities when we do the blood flow. Don't get the blood flow, right? Okay. Let's see. Okay, the lovely pictures on page 615 in my book of the varicose vein. It's a little nicer than mine, right? Varicose veins, veins that are swollen, dilated, tortuous. More than 15% of adults. The causes are heredity, prolonged standing. Notice I don't stand in the same place for very long, do I? I'm always walking back and forth, right? Okay. The blood pools in the lower limbs and the valves weaken. The walls of the vein stretches. Then we get the spider veins, the superficial ones. Okay. Okay. Let's also talk about, for just a minute, the venous sinuses. Okay? The venous sinuses, right? We already talked about in the heart. On the back of the heart, right? You got your left and right coronary off of the left comes that circumflex around and such. A branch off of the right, I forget the name of it. But anyway, they wrap around to the back of the heart, and on the back of the heart you have the coronary sinus. Remember? Coronary sinus. It's a vein, it's a flat vein, it's kind of large, and blood pools in there before it goes into the heart, right? So that's one area, okay? The coronary sinus, okay? Now, in the brain, we have dural sinuses, right? In the dura, right? And their purpose is to drain that CSF fluid and the blood off the brain, okay? Okay? Now, I need to enlighten you with one more word. Anastomosis, right? What in the heck does that mean? It's really simple, right? You see these all over the body, but especially around the joints, okay? We said, if I bend my knee, I may be squeezing off some blood vessels, right? So an anastomosis is where different blood vessels come together. And some are called arterial to arterial, some are arterial to venous, some are venous to venous. But anyway, anastomoses is a fancy word for when several blood vessels come together, right? Right? If you look at the back of your hand many times, if you get old and you get the veins sticking out, right? You can see. And if I push on this vein right here, guess what? The blood gets shunted to the other veins around it. If I push on this one over here, the blood keeps flowing, but it flows a different way, right? Another word for that is collateral circulation. But anyway, anastomosis, okay? Right? If I have a blood vessel that gets clogged up and I have a heart attack, right? And this is scar tissue here, then sometimes I will have collateral circulation, right? I will have other blood vessels develop to bypass that area. Collateral circulation, right? What does collateral mean? Kind of off to the sides. In war, what is collateral damage? In war, civilians always get killed, right? They don't want them to, they're not supposed to, except unless you're Russian. But anyway, that's another story, right? But in wars, always civilians get killed, right? They're collateral damage, right? We have morals. We try not to kill civilians, right? As opposed to the Russians. But anyway, collateral. So collateral means working the way around, and collateral circulation. If I bend my knee right here and I squeeze a blood vessel, well, it can go through another channel through an anastomosis. That's what that term means, okay? Anastomosis. And again, they can be arterial to arterial or arterial to venous, okay? Now, we do not have those anastomosis in the retina, in the kidneys, or the spleen. Okay? The retina, the kidneys, or the spleen do not have anastomosis. Okay? Now, let's talk just a little bit about blood flow. Okay? Let's talk just a little bit about blood flow. Okay? Or even more than that, fluid instead of blood. Okay? Okay. Resistance. Right? Resistance. Right? The amount of resistance to blood flow, I would use the word friction. Right? In a vessel. Right? Now, remember, if you have, it can be blood, it can be water, any fluid that's flowing through a pipe, as it rubs against the side, that causes friction. Okay? And that causes resistance. Now, we talked about yesterday, remember, the right side of the heart just pumps the blood this far, so there's not very much resistance. But the left side of the heart, the main pump of the heart, pumps it to the big toe. And a blood vessel from here going down to my big toe is this long, right? So therefore, there's going to be more resistance. Peripheral resistance, right? Periphery from the outside, right? From the edges, right? So in the systemic circulation, right? Not the pulmonary, in the systemic, there's more peripheral resistance. Remember? What's the blood pressure systemic? 120/80. What's the blood pressure pulmonary? 24/10, right? 5 times as high. Yes? Okay? So resistance has to do with, or we call it peripheral resistance. Okay? Now, viscosity, 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 right? What in the heck does that mean? I'm not a specialist in fluids, but I'll explain it this way. Yes? Motor oil for your vehicle. There's 30 weight, there's 20 weight, there's 50 weight, right? And viscosity has to do with resistance to flow. It has to do with how sticky the particles are that want to stick together, or do they want to flow through the pipe, okay? So viscosity is the internal resistance of a fluid to flow, okay? Most of the time, the viscosity of our blood is about the same, unless we get super dehydrated or something, or we have another condition going on. Okay? We said, too, with resistance, if you have a little short pipe, you have a little resistance. If you have a big long pipe, right, we have more resistance. Because with a short pipe, there's less space that fluid's going to rub up against it. Okay? Okay, let's talk about the diameter. Okay, this is a 1/2 inch pipe, and this is a 3/4 inch pipe. Yes? Okay. Think about this. Most of the time in your house, you got 1/2 inch pipe. But coming from the water meter into your house, you probably got 3/4 inch pipe. Okay? Right? Now, am I going to get more water through a 1/2 inch pipe or a 3/4 inch pipe?
The bigger pipe.
The bigger pipe, right? Yes? Now, plumbers understand this. If I got a 1/2 inch pipe and a 3/4 inch pipe, I'm going to get X amount of flow through here, and I'm going to get more flow through here because it's bigger and fatter pipe, right? What is the difference from a 1/2 to a 3/4? How much more water am I going to get through that pipe? Okay? I love plumbers. Plumbers have saved way more lives than any doctor ever dreamed of, right? How? Sanitation, by getting rid of waste material from us, right? By getting rid of those germs, yes? So, people look down on plumbers. I love plumbers. Plumbers are heroes. It's hard work. It's dirty and nasty sometimes. You know what the difference between a plumber and a surgeon is? A plumber washes his hands after the operation, right? But anyway, what's the difference between here and here? Logically, what would you think? A 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch? What would you think? Right? If you look at the pipe end on, here's the 1/2, here's the 3/4, right? What would the difference be? What would you think? Well, let's see. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. What?
A quarter.
A quarter. 25% more, right? Yes? That makes sense, doesn't it, logically? It's a 1/4 inch bigger, so you would get 25% more. Sorry, no. It's unbelievable, and I can't explain you why. You got to be a fluid dynamics specialist. Okay? But what happens is you get tremendously more through here. I was talking to one of my patients, a plumber, about this, and he said the difference between a 1/2 inch and a 3/4 inch pipe. He said, if I want to get the same amount of water and I'm running 1/2 inch, guess how many pipes he said I have to do to equal a 3/4 inch pipe? How many 1/2 inch pipes do I have to do to get as much water as I can get through a 3/4? 5, honest to God, that's what he said. I have to run 5 1/2 inch pipes to get as much water as I get out of 1 3/4. Now, my house was built in 1906, and guess what? I got the pleasure of replumbing the whole house, right? Had 2 little boys, and I replumbed that whole blooming house, okay? And you know, I've had a dog for years and years and years, almost always had a dog, and you're standing there with the water filling up the big bucket, right? Water for the dog, yes? God, it seemed like it took forever. So when I replumbed my house, guess what I did? I run 3/4 inch over there. And now, in 20 seconds, I fill up that big bucket, whereas before I'd be standing there for 2.5 minutes, right? Because you get so much water flow through that 3/4 inch. It's something about, you know, if you put this pipe inside this pipe, all this room around here, it's just amazing how much more water. Now, when I was on the city council, they had a guy, and the house tap is 3/4 inch. And he said, well, I have a shop. No, I want a 2 inch tap for my shop. Did we let him have a 2 inch tap? No, we didn't let him have a 2 inch tap, because if we would have let him have a 2 inch tap, guess what? All of his neighbors would have got no water, because he was getting 10 times as much water as they would get, right? So we didn't let him do that. We let him go, I think, up to 1 inch, but not more than that, okay? Because we knew all the neighbors, mega hassle, right? It wasn't right to the neighbors. But anyway, because by just going up a 1/4 inch, you get so much more. Why did I go through this whole thing about plumbing and this and that? Because when our blood vessels get bigger, they hold so much more blood. And when you run the same amount of water through a little bitty small pipe, it's like a pressure washer, right? You can run 50 pounds of pressure, which is normal for a house, out a water hose, and the water will go too. But if you take that same 50-pound pressure and you run it through a pressure washer, and there's a tiny little hole at the end of that, and that water comes out, it'll knock the paint off your car. Ask me how I know, right? Yes? There's some of the siding on my house I got to repaint. I haven't got to it there yet, but I'm taking a pressure washer up there, right? Before I paint that, to knock all that old paint that's flaking off, right? So, vasodilation and vasoconstriction has major ramifications, is what I'm getting at, okay? Oh, by the way, if you clog your arteries, and you had a big old fat artery, but now that artery is all clogged up, guess what you're doing? You're way cutting down on the blood flow, right? Sorry, I gotta get another pen here. Okay? So it's a big deal. It's major, right? Okay? Okay. Laminar flow. Laminar, laminar flow. Okay. What does that mean? That means this. That means smooth flow through a vessel. Okay? Or it doesn't have to be a vessel, but anyway, that means this. The water or the blood is just flowing through there, no problems. Guess what happens, right? If if I have plaques in that blood vessel, then this blood has to go boom, 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 right? Yes? How many of you raise your hand you've been whitewater rafting? Yes? Okay, you go whitewater rafting and you look ahead, right? And it's usually very narrow and there's not a lot of rocks and you will go flying through there, right? But then again, if you look and there's a rock here and a rock here and a rock here and a rock here and a rock here, and the water does this, right? And what do you get there? You get a bunch of rapids, don't you? Right? If you see a river and there's no obstructions in that, do you hear that river? No. But if there's a bunch of rocks and that water is slamming into those rocks and going around like that, it's loud, it's noisy, right? It's noisy, it's loud. Have you camped right next to the water? I did last weekend, yes, and it, yes? So laminar flow means nice and smooth and no obstructions. But when we clog those arteries in our heart, in our legs, our aorta, right? When we do that, we don't get a nice smooth laminar flow, okay? Realize that. This flow is turbulent. Think of atherosclerosis, clogging of them arteries, build up in those arteries, right? Think about that. We don't get a laminar flow there, yes? Well, by the way, in the heart, when it does like that, and it bifurcates, right? When it splits into two, that's called bifurcation, right? Guess where we get the buildup? Right here, commonly, right? That's where we get the buildup, where it splits, where it bifurcates, okay? Okay, systolic, we already talked about that. Systolic, 120 on the top, right? It's normal. Systolic, I always remember systolic, squeeze, right? That's the top number, okay? Diastolic, 70 to 80 on the bottom, right? Systolic is the squeezing and the aorta stretches, and diastolic is the heart relaxing and that pressure going out of that aorta and the pressure relaxing off. A heart rests during diastolic, okay? Okay? Now, a few concepts you're going to have to write down, okay? Let's talk about pulse pressure. Pulse pressure, okay? Pulse, P-U-L-S-E, pressure. Systolic, diastolic. And we said normal is what? 120 over 80? Right? Okay, this is a tough one. I'm going to ask you, Christian. 120 minus 80 equals 120 minus 80 equals
40.
40. The pulse pressure is 40. Right? It's the difference between the two. Pulse pressure is 40. Okay? Now, you will notice that when people get older, as a general rule, especially if they get heavier, their blood pressure gets higher, okay? But when they get older and they have clogging of the arteries, what happens is their blood pressure may be 150 over 90, 156 over 88, right? So what is the pulse pressure here?
30.
No, 150 minus 90 is
60.
60, right? The pulse pressure there is 60. The pulse pressure here would be 58, right? Is that the difference? 68, pardon me, 68, right? Anyway, my point being is this. When we get old and that those arteries are not doing this, they're not stretching like that, when that heart beats, because the aorta doesn't stretch, many times the top number is higher. But many times, too, the bottom number gets lower. It's commonly, I have taken 150 over 60. The guy was in his 80s. Pulse pressure would be 90. What does that tell me, by the way? He probably has some clogging of his arteries. He probably has some atherosclerosis. It's a common thing. It happens to us as we get older. The pulse pressure gets bigger and bigger. Normal pulse pressure, about 40. Okay? Normal pulse pressure, about 40. Okay? Atherosclerosis dramatically increases the pulse pressure because the elastic arteries become less stretchy. That's what I wrote down. Okay? Now, you have to know how to figure pulse pressure. I'm going to ask you probably on the test to figure pulse pressure. It's so simple, but anyway, you got to know pulse pressure. Okay, how to figure it. Systolic minus diastolic, let's see, L, I see, equals pulse pressure, okay? Right? Now, let's talk about the next one, right? The next one, and that is mean arterial pressure, okay? M-A-P, okay? Mean arterial pressure. Mean. My sister is so mean. Blah, 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 blah. Is that what they're talking about?
No.
No. Mean means
Oh.
average. Average, right? Mean arterial pressure, okay? Let me explain. I was talking to a nurse about this one time, right? When you're in ICU, they got you hooked up, and every time you turn around, they're taking your blood pressure. It's an automatic machine that does it, right? And on that thing, it'll show your EKG, the heartbeat, and it says MAP. MAP, mean arterial pressure, right? And the doctor comes walking in there, and the first thing he does is look at that and looks at the MAP. It's really more important than the blood pressure, but anyway. And what in the heck is that? Mean means the average arterial pressure, mean arterial pressure, okay? Because when the heart squeezes, we have so much pressure. When the heart relaxes, we have so much pressure. But it averages out by the time you get to the veins, right? The veins, we don't have a systolic, diastolic in a vein, right? And so what happens is that the MAP is basically an average of how much pressure is pushing through that peripheral system and how much resistance there is and how much blood flow are you getting to your tissues, okay? So, okay? MAP, make sure you write this one down, equals diastolic plus pulse pressure, okay? Mean arterial pressure is diastolic plus the pulse pressure divided by 3 equals MAP. All right, let's do it with a normal person. A normal person, a teenager, 120 over 80, right? Okay, 120 plus, what's the pulse pressure? If the blood pressure is 120 over 80,
40.
Pulse pressure is 40. 40 divided by 3 is equal to about 39, right? 39 and a third, okay? So 120 plus about 13, right, is, 80. Not the systolic, the diastolic, sorry. 80 plus 40 divided by 3 is about 13. 80 plus 13 equals 93. MAP is 93, okay? MAP is 93. Notice, it's a little higher than the diastolic, pardon me. right? It's higher than the diastolic, but it's an average of how much blood flow, how much tissue perfusion. Is the person's heart working enough to pump blood to his big toe, right? Okay. Right? It's a measure of tissue perfusion. Tissue perfusion. How much blood's getting everywhere? Right? Anyway, I just know talking to an ICU nurse, I said, that MAP, they care a lot about that. She goes, yeah, they don't even look at the blood pressure. She just walks in there, what's the MAP? Okay, got it. Yeah. Right? That's more important than the blood pressure. See? Depending on what the numbers are, right? Okay. Okay. Now, you are going to have to, on the test, tell me what the pulse pressure is. I'm going to give you, okay, let's say it was 90/60. What would the pulse pressure be? Pulse pressure equals 30, right? Very simple. And you have to know that because I'm going to ask you maybe to figure an MAP also, right? So if the diastolic is 60 and the pulse pressure is 30 divided by 3 is a constant, meaning that's always the same. 30 divided by 3 is 10. MAP is 70. Right? Right? Yes? Yes? So, do I need to go over this again? No. It's really very simple. But you're going to have to know these because I'm going to ask you to figure what the pulse pressure is. And this question right after that is going to be probably what is the MAP. Right? Some years I forget that when I'm writing the test, but I try not to. Okay? Okay. Now, okay, and again, we talked about that, right? Arterial pressure here, by the time we get the capillary rate, it's 35. By the time we get over here, it's 17. Here, there's a pulse. Over here, the pulse has pretty much gone away. It's a constant pressure. Cut an artery, spurt, spurt, spurt. Cut a vein, dribble, 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 right? Okay? Now, we already talked about this too, yes? The skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle. By squeezing the skeletal muscle, we squeeze blood back to the heart, and that's called the... Make a muscle for me.
Oh, sorry.
Whoa! Muscular pump. The muscular pump, right? Yes? And the other one is the respiratory pump, right? Yes? Now, what else makes us send blood back to the heart, right? Okay, number 1, muscular. Number 2, respiratory. Number 3 is the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system does this. Remember how I said veins are capacitance vessels. And those capacitance vessels, when they do this, and they squeeze down, the pressure goes up. And when they squeeze, guess where the blood goes? Back to the heart, right? Yes? And what does sympathetic nerve supply to the blood vessels do? Vasoconstriction, right? So when they squeeze, it raises the blood pressure and that blood goes back to the heart. Okay? So 3 ways that we pump blood back to the heart. The muscular pump, the respiratory pump, sympathetic nerve supply. Okay? Right? Remember, heart is dominated by parasympathetic through the vagus, baby. Right? But the blood vessels are dominated by sympathetics, right? Sympathetics. Okay? Yes. Now, let's talk about how we maintain blood pressure. Okay? Let's talk about how we maintain blood pressure. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about short-term and long-term. And let me explain that. Yes? Okay? Now, okay, did you see Did you see that mall shooting? I believe it was yesterday or day before. Yeah. And what happened was some crazy guy goes in the bathroom with 3 guns and he sits there for an hour and then he comes out and he shoots 3 people and he wounds 2 others. He kills 3 of them. And there's a 22-year-old kid there with a Glock and he does this. He pulls his Glock, he leans against the pole and he goes boom, boom, boom. He put 8 out of 10 bullets in the bad guy and killed him within 15 seconds. Right? Yes? He reacted suddenly. Good guy with the gun. That's what happened. If you're in that situation, you need some blood pressure, right? You got to run. Yes? And you got to run very quickly. That guy had to react very quickly. So, at times our blood pressure goes up very quickly. At times it goes up, but it goes up very slowly depending on the situation. So we're going to talk about the short term and the long term and how the body controls it short term and long term. Okay? Yes? Right? Yes. Thank the Lord for that guy. I guarantee you all those people in there that didn't get killed are very grateful that guy had a gun. Right? And the cops immediately said, oh man, this guy did everything right and only 3 people got killed. And the shot was 40 yards. 40 yards is a long way with a pistol. A long way with a pistol. Right? Most of the time, most gunfights are within 7 yards. But anyway, evidently the boy knew what he was doing because he leaned against the deal. I wonder if he was in the Marine Corps. But anyway, okay? Short term. S-H-O-R, short term regulation, right? Okay? Neuronal control. N-E-U-R-O-N-A-L-C-O-N-T-R-O-L. Number 1, baroreceptors. Baroreceptors, right? Baroreceptors, okay? We maintain adequate MAP by altering the diameter of our blood vessels moment by moment, okay? Our blood vessels, those baroreceptors send signals to the medulla, right? Autonomic nervous system, cardioacceleratory, cardioinhibitory. And those blood vessels are constantly doing that, getting bigger, getting smaller. Lower blood pressure, higher blood pressure. That's what's happening constantly, depending on the situation. If I get up and I start walking, I probably need a little higher blood pressure, right? If I sit down, chill out, I'm probably going to have some lower blood pressure, right? Okay? So, to maintain adequate MAP, remember, tissue perfusion, we alter the blood vessel diameter. Okay? If we have low blood volume, maybe we lost some blood or such, they're going to squeeze down, right? All vessels are going to constrict to allow as much blood flow to the heart and to the brain. Okay? The baroreceptors and the afferent fibers, A-F-F-E-R-E-N-T-F-I-B-E-R-S, right? Baroreceptors. Remember, we got a barometer hanging on the wall, and the barometer, the real expensive ones, the fancy ones, it's a box, and there's a vacuum inside the box. And when the outside pressure goes down, the box does this, expands. And when the outside pressure gets higher, guess what the box does? It contracts, right? It's called a barometer, right? Now, the cheap ones, it's a wire spring that rings around, around, and around. But anyway, the point being is, those baroreceptors, they're always monitoring and they're always sending signals. And they're sending signals afferent, right? They're sending signals afferent here and your vasomotor center, okay? Now, I didn't use that word yesterday, but the cardioacceleratory and the cardioinhibitory center is called the vasomotor, vaso for vessels, right? Okay? So, they're always sending signals, and depending, if it's low, then our body goes, kick in cardioacceleratory. If the pressure's too high, it goes, hey, cardioinhibitory, you kick in now, right? And it's constantly going back and forth to give us the right blood pressure. Okay? The vasomotor center. Okay? Okay. Okay? Cardio acceleratory and cardio inhibitory, right? And that's in the medulla oblongata, and that is called the vasomotor center. Or, center, and it keeps vasomotor tone, right? Tone, just the right amount. Not, and not, okay? Tone, the proper amount, yes? Okay. Now, let's also talk a little bit about this. It's very important we get blood flow to our big toe. It's very important that we get big toe to our blood flow to our guts. It's extremely important to get blood flow to the brain, right? So we have some receptors, right? Some baroreceptors in the aortic arch, right? And in the internal carotids, right? The internal carotids, right? Basically, the large vessels here and the large vessels here have these receptors always checking what the blood pressure is and what it needs to be, right? In the internal carotids, right, we call that the carotid, C-A-R-O-T-I-D, the carotid sinus reflex. And for the aortic arch, we call that the aortic reflex, yes, A-O-R-T-I-C-R-E-F-L-E-X, right? And this makes sure you get enough blood to your systemic, S-Y-S-T-E-M-I-C, that's the aortic, and the carotids right here, make sure you get enough blood where? To the brain, right? To the brain, yes? Very important to get enough blood to the brain, okay? The aortic reflex maintains adequate blood pressure in the systemic circulation, and the carotid reflex, low blood pressure to the brain, causes vasoconstriction and increased cardiac output, and we get more blood to the brain. Okay? Now, there's one other thing I want to mention, and that is this. Yes? Now, if I'm running a 100-yard dash, my blood pressure is going to shoot up way high, and that's pretty normal, right? But then as soon as I stop, and I sit down, and I rest, and I catch my breath, my blood pressure is going to go down pretty quick, yes? That's normal. So for a very short amount of time, I had real high blood pressure, and then it went down, yes? Okay? Well, here's the thing. People that have high blood pressure, right? Those baroreceptors are always checking the pressure. But if you run high pressure for a long period of time, your brain will kind of reset. Yes? Your brain will reset, and your brain will think, oh, it's just normal. 150 over 90, that's a normal blood pressure, when it should be 120 over 80. Right? Now, 150 over 90 is fine if I run a sprint, then I sit down, but it should go back down to 120 over 80. But if I have high blood pressure for too long, those baroreceptors get triggered. And they adapt, and our brain adapts and starts to thinking that's normal when it's not normal. And it shouldn't be, and it's not good for us, and it's going to damage our kidneys, right? And our brain. Okay? So, okay. See where I'm at here. Chronic hypertension. The baroreceptors can be reprogrammed. And then it takes higher and higher blood pressure to send signals to the medulla that says, calm things down. Okay? Now, real important. uh, we talked about your carotid and your aortic arch, the carotid sinus reflex and the aortic arch reflex. Okay, guess what? Those are baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are mechanical, right? But we also have chemoreceptors, chemo for chemicals, chemoreceptors right next to these, right? And what does that mean? That means if I do this and I hold my breath for a long period of time, what's going to happen to my blood? Is it going to get more acid or is it going to get basic? If I hold my breath, turn red in the face, I'm going to produce a lot of CO2. My blood's going to get more acid, right? My blood's going to get more acid. I'm not getting rid of that CO2, right? Or just the opposite, if I hyperventilate, right? Yes? So we have chemoreceptors here in the aortic arch and the carotids, right? They're right close to the baroreceptors, and they will influence those autonomic system in the medulla to make our heart go faster, to make us breathe faster, and this and that. They're not baroreceptors. Baroreceptors, like a barometer, it's a mechanical thing. But chemoreceptors they're checking the pH. Is the CO2 building up in the hydrogen ions in the blood going more and more acidic? Or is it going just the opposite, right? Okay. Okay. Now, what we just talked about, this is the short term, right? Now, let's talk about the long term, okay? The long term control of our blood pressure. Okay? Long term's up to the kidneys. Okay? Long term is up to the kidneys, right? So what happens is this. The kidneys are amazing, and they make adjustments all the time. And we said most of us average about 5 liters of blood. And the kidneys work it to where most of the time our blood volume is the same for an average 5 liters, men a little more, women a little less, right? But anyway, and so the kidneys, right? Remember, renin, angiotensinogen, aldosterone, that pathway, right? So the renin, angiotensin, then aldosterone. Renin from the kidneys, angiotensin, aldosterone. Right? Right? The aldosterone, we save sodium, which therefore makes us save water and get rid of potassium, right? Yes? Remember that pathway? And remember, this is the glomerular cells from the kidney. Give this off. This is a blood protein that's floating around in your protein floating around in your blood all the time. And remember, that cleaves this, and this goes angiotensin, da 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 da. I don't want to go through that, but anyway, I don't remember it all. But anyway, basically, you end up with that stimulates aldosterone. Aldosterone from the adrenals, right? Adrenals, adrenals. Remember where the adrenals sit? Right on top of the kidney. right? And the aldosterone tells the kidney, hey, save that sodium. And remember, we always say where the sodium goes, the water flows. So if we save sodium, we're going to save water. And if we save water, our blood volume is going to go up. And if the blood volume goes up, what's going to happen to my blood pressure? No, ma'am. Up. Goes up, right? Because over the long term, how much fluid I have in my circulatory system determines what my blood pressure is. I'm talking about sitting at rest. I'm not talking about jogging a race, right? Yes, it's going to go faster when I jog a race, but the long-term determinant is the kidneys through this pathway, through aldosterone, this hormone, and the aldosterone will kick on and off depending on what it needs to do, right? And such. Okay? Right? Basically, blood pressure too high, kidneys will say, get rid of the water. Blood pressure too low, kidneys will say, save the water. Right? Blood pressure too low, kidneys will say, save the sodium. Blood pressure too high, get rid of the sodium. Get rid of the sodium, we'll be a bunch of water out, and our blood pressure will go down. So over the long term, the kidneys are doing it. But over the short term, I'm playing sports. No, it's going to be those baroreceptors, right? And those chemoreceptors. Okay? Yes? Now, here we go. We talked about one more mechanism too. Atrial natriuretic, right? Protein peptide, right? Versus aldosterone, right? ANP, right? That's going to lower the blood pressure by lowering the blood volume. Aldosterone increase the BP by increase the blood volume, right? Yes? Anytime I draw one of those, you need to write that down. That's the easiest way to remember it, trust me. Okay? They're opposites, right? And again, I use Dr. Peter Fong's phrase, counter-regulatory hormones, right? Yes, to keep it homeostasis, to keep it right, to keep it from not getting too high, not getting too low. Yes? Right? Remember, A and P. Where does A and P come from? Remember, for the most part, the lining of the atria. That's the A, atrial. Right? Yes? And again, aldosterone from the adrenals, right? You say mineralocorticoids. Yes? 3 times real fast. Mineralocorticoids, right? Yes? The outer layer. Yes? Okay. Now, in my book on in my book, figure 18.12, right? Figure 18.12. I need you to look at that, right? Basically, it shows you the body sites where we take the pulse, okay? If you're going to be a nurse, you need to know those, right? Sometimes the arm is burnt. You can't take the pulse on the arm or the wrist. Yes? Sometimes you got to take it on the foot, right? Dorsalis pedis. Yes? Sometimes behind the kneecap, popliteal. Yes? Most of the time we take it the radial and the brachial, right? Okay. There's those. Let's talk just a little bit about high blood pressure, okay? Pre-hypertension is considered 140/90. Prehypertension, prehypertension, 140/90. If you get higher than that, you're considered to have hypertension, okay? Prehypertension values up to, but not 140/90, okay? 30% of people over 50 years old are hypertensive. About 30% of people over 50. That's a shame. What does that mean, by the way? That means they haven't taken care of themselves and their arteries are getting stiff and they smoked way too much, right? And you don't have good compliance, right? And such. And so 30% are hypertensive over 50 years old, okay? And again, I've talked about this before. If you have high blood pressure for long periods of time, it strains your heart. You can put up with that for 10 or 15 years, but then your heart begins to fail. That's what happens, okay? The problem is they call the hypertension the silent killer because you don't know you got a problem until 15 years later, kaboom, you have a stroke or you have a heart attack or you die, right? So it weakens the heart gradually, right? It's the same concept. Does one cigarette kill you and give you lung cancer? Does a pack of cigarettes kill you and give you lung cancer? No, it's doing it for, theoretically, it could possibly, right? But no, it's doing that for years and years and years, right? My father died of lung cancer. He smoked for 46 years, and then he quit for 9, right? But the damage was done, see? It's the same way with high blood pressure. It doesn't hurt you. You run a foot race for 15 or 20 minutes. You're running that 5K, and you got the higher blood pressure. But that's not going to hurt you. Actually, that's going to be very good for you. But it's high blood pressure for a long period of time. Okay? 90% of the people, 90% have essential or primary, P-R-I-M-A-R-Y, or primary hypertension, right? Yes? What does that mean? Essential primary hypertension. Okay? That means they don't know why the heck you got it. They have no idea. They just know you got it. Okay? Now, 10% are called secondary hypertension. Okay? Let me explain that. Okay? About 10% of the people have a problem that causes them to have high blood pressure. Like kidney failure, you'll have high blood pressure. Like, think about this, a little child, okay? Here's the aorta coming down, yes? Here's the artery, the renal artery to the kidney, right? If, I should have drawn it bigger. If there's a constriction right there, and not very much blood is getting through to that kidney thinks, we have low blood pressure. And it will make you have high blood pressure because of the constriction there. So about 10% of the people, we know they have high blood pressure. They have high blood pressure because, and if you have a child that has high blood pressure, you better be checking into that. It's a big deal, okay? Because if there's a constriction, the medical doctors are amazing. They'll cut it out, and they'll restore blood flow, and their blood pressure goes back to normal, okay? So, anyway, essential hypertension, they say etiology unknown. I don't know, I wish I knew, right? Now, that's what the book says, okay? Now, off script here, I'm a low carber. When you really lower your carbohydrates, it takes about 6 weeks and your blood pressure goes way down. You stop retaining fluid. The amount of fluid in your circulatory system goes down, right? Or you go on any type of diet, for the first couple of days you lose a couple of pounds, and what is it? Water weight, right? You didn't really lose so many pounds, you just eat it out, you're retaining more fluid. And if you do that for 6 weeks or longer, then what happens is your blood pressure goes down, okay? In fact, what what is that guy's name? There's a famous medical doctor at Duke University, Eric Westphal, Dr. Westphal, right? He's been treating and doing research on low carb for the last 25 years, okay? And Dr. Westphal, he says, whenever I put a patient on the low carb, I give them my cell phone number and I tell them if your blood pressure gets too low, because most of them, they're overweight and they're on high blood pressure pills. He tells me, if you start feeling bad, if you think you're going to faint, you call me, and he has to lower their blood pressure medicine down. And very commonly, not always, but very commonly, a large amount of the people, in time he takes them off their blood pressure medicines. Okay? Just because they're not retaining as much fluid, because what they're eating is not making them retain fluid, right? What goes in their mouth is determining what their blood pressure is. But it takes a couple of weeks. But he said, I always give him my cell phone and tell him, you start feeling bad, you call me. And he says, commonly I have to adjust their medicine. But anyway, right? Now, not everyone, but it's very common he has to adjust it down. Some he totally goes off of it and such. Okay? Now, our book says, what are the causes? Hereditary, it runs in the family. Number 2 is diet. How many of you know this, though? When you say hereditary, then the next one is diet, right? Yes? Guess what? Your kids grow up and you feed them. Then when they move out of the house and grow up and this and that, what do they eat? What you fed them, right? So is it really hereditary? Or is it they ate what mom fed them, right? Yes, right? Obesity, right? They say a pound of fat has about a mile worth of capillaries in it. And so the heart has to squeeze that blood through that extra mile, okay? Right? Age. As we get older, our blood vessels, as a general rule, get stiffer and our blood pressure goes higher, okay? Diabetics. Diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, right? 3 strands of one cord is my opinion. But anyway. Stress. Have you ever known people that they get stressed out, they get red in the face very quickly, and their blood pressure can shoot up, right? Yes. And of course, smoking. Smoking's going to make your blood pressure go up, okay? The treatment, drugs, diuretics, you pee it out, beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, and angiotensin converting ACE inhibitors. And I hate that when I can't read my own writing. Jeez. But anyway, okay. Now let's talk about the opposite, hypotension. Okay? Hypotension. Yes? Okay. Hypotension. Low blood pressure, right? Normally, low blood pressure hypotension, Hypotension, 90/60, right? Normally, if you have a low blood pressure, guess what that's associated with? Usually, you have a low blood pressure that's associated with a long and healthy life. That's what it's associated with. And lack of cardiovascular disease, okay? Many times, okay? But let's talk about this. Orthostatic hypotension. What is orthostatic? Right? Have you ever been sitting on the couch and the commercial comes on and you head for the refrigerator quick? Right? I know Joseph has. Yes? And you jump up too fast and you go like this and you go, oh, I'm going to faint. Yes? Have you ever felt that? Yes? That's orthostatic hypotension. You got up too quick. It's very common. Right? Now, when you get old like me, if you drink too much Diet Dr. Pepper before you go to bed at night, right? You got to get up in the middle of the night. And when I've been laying there, right? Yes, and when I get up, guess what? I had to sit there for a minute. Because if I just jump up, I'll get in the bathroom and then I'll do this, whoa, and grab the wall because I'm falling over because my blood pressure is too low and I took off too fast, right? I don't know if you've ever experienced that.
I ran into a wall.
Yes, no, it's very common, right? Okay, okay, yes. I'll tell you too one on me. I went to climb this mountain. I drove 10 hours and I jumped down in the tent. And in order to not have altitude sickness, I drank a bunch, right? Well, that means, as old as I am, that I had to get up in the night and go pee. So I get up in the night, and there's this little bitty pine tree about that big around, yes? So I'm standing there watering the tree, and then all of a sudden, oh, I'm laying on the ground, and ow, my face, right? See, I've been laying like that for a long time, and then I get up, and I'm peeing on the tree, and guess what? I fainted because my blood pressure was too low, and my face went into the pine needles, and I wake up laying on the ground. And oh, by the way, that part of the brain that has to do with visual and the eyes, yeah, right? That was getting no brain. That was getting no blood. That's why I blacked out like that, and I woke up, you know. Now, that happened to me again several years later, but I knew what to do. So whenever I got up and I felt that, what did I do immediately? Sit down on the ground for just a minute. Give yourself a minute. Your blood pressure will go up. And then I'd sit up and went pee, right? But if I feel that coming on, I know right what to do. Yes? Okay? But anyway. Orthostatic. It's a temporary drop in blood pressure, rise from a chair too fast. Okay. Elderly people, that can happen to them if they get up too quick because their sympathetic nervous system doesn't work as good as it did when they were younger, okay? We make split-second changes when we're young, but when we're older, it takes a little longer. Now, I used to be a runner. I used to run a lot of 5Ks, and I would start, and all the young people, boom, take off like a rocket, right? And I'd be running just as fast as I could, right? But I couldn't keep up with them because when I start out, my heart rate's a lot slower. My sympathetics were slower, right? But then about a quarter mile, they're slowing down. And about a half a mile, they're slowing down more. And about 3/4 of a mile, I caught up to them. And about a mile, I was passing them, is what would happen. Because it took a mile to get my heart really clicking. Boom, 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 boom. I can't go from 0 to full speed in a split second like those kids can, right? But they couldn't sustain it for long periods of time. So that was very common. And after a while, I got to where I didn't even worry about it. I didn't worry. They're way ahead of me. Yeah? Because little by little, I just reel them in. And the good ones, the young ones, the tracksters who run all the time, yeah, I couldn't reel those guys in. But most of the people who weren't the real tracksters, yeah, I just reel them in. It usually takes 3/4 of a half a mile, yes, and such. But again, just because my sympathetics aren't as quick, right? Yes. Okay. Let me pause this for a second, and I'll tell you another one. Okay.